The HOA president called 911 on me for swimming in my own lake. What happened next ended her career forever. I'm floating peacefully when sirens pierce the mountain air. Deputy Martinez races down the muddy bank, boots slipping on wet rocks, expecting real trouble. Delilah Wickham stands on her manicured lawn pointing at me like I'm public enemy number one. "Officer, he's trespassing on community water! Arrest him!" The bitter taste of injustice hits my throat as she lies to a cop's face about my property. But this woman just made a fatal error. You see, I'm a retired Coast Guard engineer, and I know something she doesn't. Federal maritime law trumps every HOA rule ever written. This lake isn't just mine. It's federally protected. I calmly reach into my waterproof case, smile at the confused deputy. "Ma'am, you just committed several federal crimes, on camera." 6 months later, Delilah lost everything. House, reputation, freedom, all because she picked the wrong lake to steal. What would you do if your HOA weaponized police against you? Drop your location and craziest HOA story below. Meet Rex Thornfield. That's me. 52 years old, recently retired Coast Guard Marine engineer, and officially done with suburbia's bullshit. 2 years ago, I watched my wife Sarah lose her battle with cancer while the smell of hospital antiseptic burned my nostrils and fluorescent lights hummed their death song overhead. After her funeral, I sold our cookie-cutter house and used every penny, savings plus Sarah's life insurance, to escape to what the realtor nervously called a unique opportunity with some neighbor concerns. 40 acres of Montana wilderness featuring a 12-acre spring-fed lake, a cabin older than bell-bottom jeans, and a gravel access road that crunched like Captain Crunch under my truck tires. The previous owner, 80-year-old hermit Walt Kruger, had ignored HOA letters for decades while living completely off-grid. Legend says Walt once chased HOA reps away with a shotgun loaded with rock salt and righteous fury. My kind of neighbor. My first dawn, I stood barefoot on weathered dock planks, breathing pine-sweetened air so clean it made my chest ache with joy. The lake mirrored snow-capped peaks perfectly while spring water bubbled up from hidden depths, creating gentle music that echoed off granite cliffs. I cupped the crystal liquid. Cold as liquid diamonds, tasting exactly like Sarah's dream of growing old somewhere beautiful and free. Research revealed fascinating history. My lake formed from natural springs feeding Clearwater Creek, which connected directly to the federally protected Salmon River system. Walt had purchased this land in 1952, back when environmental protection meant don't dump motor oil in the creek, dummy. The original property deed mentioned natural water features with existing navigation rights preserved under federal territorial law. That legal language would prove very important later. Enter Delilah Wickham, designer-clad plague with terminal clipboard addiction. Picture a 47-year-old woman treating her neighborhood like a personal kingdom, where she reigns as supreme dictator of aesthetic perfection, always sporting tennis whites or designer athleisure, wielding her clipboard like a medieval weapon of mass HOA destruction. Husband Garrett owns Wickham Construction, builds McMansions with all the structural integrity of cardboard boxes, but they photograph beautifully for Instagram. Their house screamed magazine perfection, manicured lawn sharp enough to perform surgery, imported flowers arranged with military precision, driveway so pristine you could eat dinner off the asphalt. I later discovered they'd mortgaged everything to fund Pinecrest Phase 2, a massive luxury development requiring my lake's complete destruction for maximum profit. Delilah invaded during week 2, uninvited and armed with her legendary 47-page HOA manifesto. I was replacing rotted dock boards, the sweet scent of fresh pine mixing with morning lake mist, when she appeared in spotless white sneakers. She surveyed my property like a health inspector discovering week-old sushi at a gas station. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm Delilah Wickham, Pinecrest Estates HOA president. We need to address your serious non-compliance issues immediately." She pointed at my dock like it was radioactive waste. "This ramshackle structure violates multiple aesthetic guidelines. And that fishing equipment, completely inappropriate visual pollution for our upscale community." I wiped wood stain from my calloused fingers, the sharp chemical scent mixing with clean mountain air. "Ma'am, I'm not part of your HOA." Her smile could freeze hellfire. "Everyone in Pinecrest follows community standards, Mr. Thornfield. Property values depend on cooperation. Surely a military man understands following established protocols." Next morning, official violation notice stuffed in my mailbox like a legal hand grenade. $500 fine demanded, immediate dock removal required within 10 days. Legal threats promising escalated enforcement through appropriate channels if I dared resist. That evening, surrounded by musty maritime law books while lake water gently lapped my dock, I started serious research. Federal navigation laws proved older than Montana statehood, and my property had fascinating protections dating to territorial days and Native American treaties. Delilah thought she'd found another suburban pushover to intimidate into profitable submission. Instead, she just declared war on someone who'd spent 30 years learning exactly which federal laws make HOA presidents wake up screaming in cold sweats. 1 week after Delilah's ultimatum expired, a shiny white pickup truck rumbled down my gravel road, kicking up dust clouds that made my eyes water and coated my coffee mug with grit. Out stepped Brad Kowalski, city code enforcement officer, clipboard clutched like a life preserver and wearing the uncomfortable expression of someone who'd rather be getting a root canal. Mr. Thornfield, I've received multiple complaints about unpermitted structures and recreational activities on your property. I invited Brad inside for coffee, noting how he kept glancing nervously toward Delilah's house perched on the hill like a prison watchtower. The poor bastard looked like he'd been drafted into someone else's personal war against sanity. Look, Brad said, stirring his coffee with all the enthusiasm of a man mixing concrete. I have to follow up on citizen complaints. That's the law. But between you and me, this seems pretty damn petty. 6 complaints in 1 week. All filed by the same person. Unpermitted dock construction, illegal boat storage, unauthorized recreational swimming area, environmental hazard, public nuisance, violation of community standards. Brad rattled off Delilah's greatest hits while I mentally prepared my nuclear option. Years of Coast Guard experience had taught me something valuable. Always research the authority behind any official complaint. Back when I was investigating maritime accidents, I learned that most local enforcement has zero jurisdiction over federally protected waters. The trick is asking them to cite the specific statute and verify it actually applies to your situation. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse, breathing in that distinctive cocktail of old paper, fluorescent lighting, and bureaucratic desperation that permeates government buildings worldwide. What I discovered in the dusty property records made me grin like a shark smelling blood. My lake predated the HOA by 70 years. The original 1952 property survey clearly designated it as a natural spring water feature with existing navigation rights preserved under territorial law. But here's where it got beautiful. Buried in a 1978 federal environmental assessment, I found Clearwater Creek officially classified as a navigable waterway under federal maritime jurisdiction. Then I stumbled across the real gold mine. The HOA's own legal covenants specifically excluded pre-existing natural water features from community oversight. Delilah's own attorney had written that exception into the founding documents. The woman had apparently never bothered reading her own rules. It's like trying to arrest someone for jaywalking on their own driveway. Armed with federal documentation that weighed more than my tackle box, I called Brad back for a lakeside meeting. We sat on my dock while morning mist rose from the water's surface like nature's own smoke machine, creating an almost mystical backdrop for legal education. Brad, I need you to understand something that changes everything. This lake connects directly to federally protected waterways under maritime law. I spread the documents across the weathered wood planks, watching his eyebrows climb toward his receding hairline as comprehension dawned. Jesus Christ, Rex, you're telling me this is federal jurisdiction? Every square inch of water, plus the immediate shoreline access rights. Maritime law has trumped local codes since before Montana was even a state, buddy. The metallic taste of vindication filled my mouth as Brad shook his head in disbelief. So basically, Delilah's been filing complaints about something she has zero authority over? Worse, she's been filing false reports with city officials about federal property. That could be a crime. But Delilah wasn't ready to surrender. That weekend, she launched her propaganda campaign, going door to door with a concerned neighbors petition claiming my activities would severely devastate property values and threaten community safety. She carried selective photos that made my modest cabin renovation look like a post-apocalyptic disaster zone. The sweet scent of victory came when 3 neighbors approached me separately to apologize, looking sheepish as teenagers caught toilet papering houses. She made it sound like you were running some kind of illegal party compound, admitted Mrs. Isla, whose rose garden smelled like heaven and bloomed like a fairy tale. We had no idea you were just trying to enjoy your own property in peace. The Patterson family was even more direct. Delilah threatened to make life very difficult through HOA enforcement if we didn't support community unity. We're withdrawing our signatures immediately. I'd learned something crucial during my military years. Bullies rely on people not knowing their actual rights. Most harassment campaigns collapse the moment someone challenges their legal authority with actual facts and documentation. But Delilah's real escalation was just beginning. She was about to drag state environmental agencies into her personal vendetta, not realizing she was about to step on a much bigger legal landmine. 2 weeks later, another government vehicle crunched down my driveway, this time a forest green state truck with Montana environmental quality emblazoned on the side like a badge of bureaucratic authority. My coffee turned bitter as burnt rubber in my mouth as I realized Delilah had escalated to the Environmental Warfare Division. Inspector Janet Morrison emerged carrying an intimidating clipboard and the stone-faced expression of someone expecting to discover serious ecological crimes. The crisp morning air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and my own nervous sweat as she surveyed my property with professional skepticism. Mr. Thornfield, I'm here investigating formal complaints about illegal wetland alteration and systematic habitat destruction. The reporting party claims you're causing significant environmental damage for personal recreation. I nearly inhaled my coffee. According to Delilah's masterpiece of creative writing, I was apparently an environmental terrorist conducting unauthorized earth-moving operations, destroying native wildlife habitats, and contaminating pristine mountain ecosystems for my own selfish enjoyment. She'd painted me as the kind of guy who'd pave paradise to build a parking lot. Inspector Morrison, I'd be delighted to show you around, but I suspect you'll find reality somewhat different from that complaint. What happened next was like watching someone's face discover they'd been totally punked by Mother Nature herself. As we toured my property, Janet's skepticism melted faster than ice cream in a blast furnace. Instead of environmental destruction, she found meticulous habitat restoration that would make a park ranger weep tears of joy. I'd spent months removing invasive purple loosestrife and Russian knapweed, replanting native sedges and wild bergamot, installing professional erosion controls along vulnerable shoreline areas. My unauthorized structures turned out to be carefully engineered fish, spawning beds, and cedar bird nesting platforms. The illegal earth moving was actually precise wetland restoration following federal best practices I'd absorbed during Coast Guard environmental response training. Mr. Thornfield, Janet said, kneeling beside crystal-clear spring water bubbling up through hand-sorted gravel, this restoration work is absolutely remarkable. Your water quality readings are textbook perfect. She tested pH levels, dissolved oxygen content, and temperature gradients while native cutthroat trout darted through the shallows like living emeralds. The lake's ecosystem was thriving under my careful stewardship, supporting wildlife populations that had been absent for decades under previous neglect. Honestly, this property demonstrates exemplary environmental management. Whoever filed this complaint either fundamentally misunderstands conservation principles or has seriously questionable motives. The irony was delicious. While Delilah accused me of environmental destruction, she was planning to literally drain my lake for profit. Meanwhile, Delilah launched her digital propaganda blitzkrieg on social media, creating a Facebook group called Protect Pinecrest from Environmental Threats that attracted every keyboard warrior within 50 miles. She posted strategically cropped photos making my rustic cabin renovation look like a condemned methamphetamine laboratory, complete with ominous captions about inappropriate activities threatening their family-safe community values. Her racist dog whistles were subtler than a foghorn at midnight. Comments about certain types of people and hand-wringing about property values declining due to unsuitable residents filled her posts like digital cancer spreading through suburban paranoia. Several neighbors privately forwarded me screenshots, disgusted by her tactics. "This isn't about environmental protection," messaged Tom Rodriguez, a local high school teacher whose integrity shone like a lighthouse. "She's conducting a harassment campaign because you don't fit her narrow definition of acceptable neighbors." But I wasn't just collecting sympathy cards. I was conducting reconnaissance. Years of Coast Guard experience investigating maritime accidents had taught me that harassment campaigns usually expose the harasser's own vulnerabilities. A little digging into public records revealed why Delilah was desperately trying to drive me away. Garrett's construction company owed $47,000 in unpaid contractor liens to local suppliers. 3 separate homeowners had filed Better Business Bureau complaints about shoddy workmanship, corner cutting, and completely abandoned projects. Their magazine-perfect house, purchased with leveraged financing that looked increasingly precarious under financial scrutiny. But here's where it got really interesting. Buried in county planning documents, I discovered a preliminary development proposal titled Pinecrest Phase 2. The plan called for draining my federally protected lake and converting the wetlands into 20 luxury home lots. Estimated project value, $8.2 million in pure profit. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. My federal environmental protections didn't just block Delilah's harassment, they completely destroyed her family's financial dreams. No wonder she was fighting so desperately. The harassment predictably escalated. Anonymous noise complaints materialized every weekend, filed precisely when I was enjoying peaceful morning fishing sessions. My mailbox suffered repeated vandalism, spray-painted with messages that smelled like cheap aerosol and teenage stupidity. Fake no trespassing signs appeared overnight on my legal access road like bureaucratic mushrooms. Then my security cameras captured pure gold. Delilah's teenage son Tyler removing my legitimate property markers at 2 a.m., his mother's white Escalade idling nearby like a suburban getaway vehicle. The kid moved with all the stealth and confidence of a giraffe attempting ballet, constantly checking his phone while committing textbook property destruction. I'd learned during 3 decades of military service that the optimal response to escalating harassment combines methodical documentation with strategic patience. Every incident got photographed, time-stamped, and filed in my expanding evidence archive. Meanwhile, I contacted Maxwell Sterling, my old Coast Guard legal officer who'd become an environmental attorney specializing in federal water rights and land use disputes. Rex, what you're describing sounds like systematic environmental harassment targeting federally protected resources. That combination can trigger federal civil rights investigations, especially with the discriminatory language patterns you're documenting. Maxwell explained something fascinating. Harassment designed to interfere with someone's legal use of federally protected environmental resources constitutes a federal crime under multiple overlapping statutes. Environmental protection laws pack serious legal firepower when local authorities attempt to override federal jurisdiction through intimidation campaigns. The sweet taste of approaching victory filled my mouth as I realized Delilah's coded language about undesirable elements was creating a federal evidence trail that investigators would find absolutely fascinating. She was essentially documenting her own civil rights violations while trying to force me off protected federal habitat. But her next desperate move would cross lines that even corrupt small-town politics couldn't protect her from crossing. 3 weeks later, Delilah pulled out her nuclear option, an emergency HOA meeting in the community center that smelled like desperation, burned coffee, and the kind of cheap air freshener they use in funeral homes. She'd invited County Commissioner Rick Hendricks, conveniently Garrett's golf buddy and Thursday night poker regular, to witness what she dramatically branded a security crisis threatening our entire community's future. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects while 30-odd neighbors shuffled reluctantly into metal folding chairs that squeaked like tortured mice. Most looked like they'd rather be getting root canals or watching paint dry. Delilah positioned herself at the front wearing her best concerned citizen costume, designer blazer that cost more than most people's cars, pearl necklace, and the kind of synthetic smile that could curdle organic milk at 50 yards. Fellow residents, she announced with the dramatic flair of a soap opera villain, we face an unprecedented threat to our property values, family safety, and community standards. She gestured toward poster boards featuring carefully manipulated photos that made my modest cabin look like a meth lab explosion site. Her masterstroke proposal, a special monthly assessment requiring every homeowner to contribute an extra $200 for enhanced security patrols, specifically targeting my property as a high-priority monitoring zone. Essentially, she wanted neighbors to crowdfund her personal vendetta against me. The audacity was breathtaking, like asking people to pay for your therapy sessions. Commissioner Hendricks nodded along like a dashboard bobblehead, occasionally grunting supportive phrases about community standards and protecting property investments. The whole performance had all the authenticity of a unicorn selling insurance. That Saturday morning, while I enjoyed a peaceful swim with my visiting nephew Jake, a Marine sergeant on leave who'd driven his Jeep up from Colorado Springs, Delilah made the call that would ultimately become her legal suicide note. 911, this is Delilah Wickham at 1247 Pinecrest Drive. I need police immediately. There are armed trespassers on community property engaging in highly suspicious activities that threaten public safety. The bitter taste of pure injustice flooded my mouth as I heard her fabricating felony accusations through my open window. She was literally watching 2 military veterans enjoying a morning swim while reporting us as dangerous criminals to armed police officers. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez arrived 23 minutes later, boots squelching through marshy shoreline mud, radio crackling with confused dispatch chatter. His expression mixed professional wariness with obvious irritation at being dragged into suburban theater during his weekend patrol shift. "Gentlemen, I received reports of armed trespassing and suspicious criminal activity. I need to see identification and understand what's happening here." I calmly swam to shore, lake water streaming off my shoulders like liquid diamonds in the morning sunlight, and reached for my waterproof document case, the same military-issue container that had survived 3 decades of Coast Guard operations in conditions ranging from Arctic storms to Gulf Coast hurricanes. "Deputy Martinez, I'm Rex Thornfield, property owner. This is my nephew Jake, Marine Sergeant visiting from Colorado. Would you like to examine the deed and federal waterway documentation?" During my Coast Guard career, I'd learned that federal waterway interference laws carry serious teeth. Any deliberate obstruction of legal navigation or recreational use on federally protected waters constitutes a federal crime, especially when false emergency reports are weaponized to harass legal users. The penalties can include federal prosecution under maritime law, civil rights violations, and conspiracy charges. Meanwhile, Delilah stood on her chemically perfect lawn 50 yards away, arms crossed like a general awaiting victory, expecting my immediate arrest and perp walk. Her confidence began evaporating faster than morning mist as Deputy Martinez studied my federal documentation with dawning comprehension. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of law enforcement authority that makes intelligent people immediately reconsider their life choices. "Did you knowingly file a false emergency report? This gentleman clearly owns this property and has federal navigation rights." "But it's community water. The HOA has absolute jurisdiction over all recreational—" "Ma'am, federal law supersedes local HOA authority. You just misused emergency services for what appears to be a personal dispute." Deputy Martinez's radio crackled as he requested the incident report number for his growing file. "Dispatch, no violations found whatsoever. Property owner lawfully exercising federal water rights on his own land. Please note this marks the 8th false complaint from this specific address within 30 days. The sweet metallic taste of vindication filled my mouth as Delilah's face cycled through more colors than a kaleidoscope having seizures. Deputy Martinez approached her with the measured gait of someone delivering very unwelcome legal education. "Mrs. Wickham, filing false emergency reports constitutes misdemeanor criminal behavior. Continued systematic abuse of 911 services will result in criminal charges and possible federal investigation. I strongly recommend consulting an attorney before making any future calls." But Delilah's public humiliation was merely the appetizer. That afternoon, she launched her final desperate Hail Mary, a federal lawsuit claiming my protection documentation was fraudulent federal impersonation designed to circumvent legitimate community oversight. She hired Blackstone and Associates, a predatory Denver law firm specializing in development litigation, paying their $60,000 retainer with money her family desperately couldn't afford to lose. Her lawsuit demanded immediate injunctive relief, preventing all water recreation activities on my property, claiming I was unlawfully interfering with planned community development through false federal claims. The legal papers reeked of expensive desperation and impending financial doom. That's when I activated my own legal artillery. Maxwell Sterling connected me directly with Dr. Patricia Vance, Environmental Compliance Specialist for the Army Corps of Engineers Northwestern Division. Her response was music to my ears. My lake enjoyed bulletproof federal protection under 6 different environmental statutes, 3 navigation laws, and 2 Native American treaty provisions dating to 1855. "Mr. Thornfield, any local interference with your federally protected navigation and recreation rights constitutes multiple federal crimes. We'll provide comprehensive documentation and, if necessary, federal law enforcement support." Meanwhile, my deeper investigation into Delilah's motivations revealed the full scope of her desperation. County planning records showed Garrett's company had invested over $300,000 in preliminary engineering for Pinecrest Phase 2, including detailed wetland drainage studies, soil composition analysis, and luxury home foundation planning. They'd leveraged their house, emptied retirement accounts, and borrowed against future profits to fund their development dreams. My federal protections didn't just interfere with their plans, they completely annihilated 8 years of planning and investment. No wonder she was fighting like a cornered Wolverine defending her last meal. But Delilah's next move would cross federal criminal lines that even corrupt small-town politics couldn't shield her from. She was about to discover that environmental terrorism against protected federal habitats attracts agencies with badges, automatic weapons, and absolutely zero tolerance for entitled suburban criminals. Storm clouds were gathering over her perfect little kingdom, and they carried federal jurisdiction. The thick manila envelope from the Army Corps of Engineers arrived on a Tuesday morning that tasted like victory and smelled like fresh hope brewing in my coffee pot. I ripped it open with trembling hands, my heart hammering like a teenager asking someone to prom, spreading official documents across Sarah's old kitchen table like a treasure map to justice. What I discovered nearly stopped my heart cold. My humble mountain lake wasn't just federally protected, it was classified as essential fish habitat under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, critical waterway infrastructure under the Clean Water Act, and protected navigation corridor under federal navigation servitude dating back to 1889 territorial law. I had more legal protection than Fort Knox and the nuclear launch codes combined. But buried in supplementary documentation, I found something that made my blood freeze faster than antifreeze in Antarctica. Environmental Impact Study, PCP 2024 Montana, submitted by Wickham Construction LLC in 2021. 47 pages of detailed planning for large-scale wetland conversion and residential development optimization. The project description read like an environmental horror story. Drain 12 acres of federally protected habitat, destroy critical fish spawning grounds, and build 20 luxury homes worth $8.2 million in pure profit. My hands actually shook as I read the federal response, stamped in angry red ink. Project categorically denied. Proposed activities constitute multiple federal environmental crimes including habitat destruction, navigation interference, and waterway contamination. Criminal prosecution recommended for any development attempts. Holy shit. Delilah had known about this federal denial for 3 goddamn years. Her entire harassment campaign wasn't petty HOA power tripping. It was criminal conspiracy to circumvent federal environmental law. She'd been systematically terrorizing me, hoping to force a panicked sale before I discovered my property's bulletproof legal status. If some ignorant developer bought my land and attempted construction, they'd face federal criminal charges while the Wickhams disappeared with millions in illegal profits. The financial records told an even more devastating story. The Wickhams had mortgaged their house, liquidated retirement accounts, maxed out 17 credit cards, and borrowed against projected development profits to fund this scheme. They'd invested over $400,000 assuming they could bulldoze through federal law using small-town intimidation and suburban corruption. But federal environmental protection doesn't negotiate with entitled suburbanites. My legal protections hadn't just blocked their development dreams, they'd guaranteed complete financial annihilation. Bank foreclosure notices, creditor lawsuits, and bankruptcy proceedings would destroy everything they'd risked on this illegal gamble. Within 18 months, the Wickhams would lose their house, their business, and possibly their freedom if federal prosecutors decided to make examples of them. The power dynamic had totally reversed. Delilah wasn't some petty dictator drunk on HOA authority. She was a desperate criminal watching her family's future collapse because she'd declared war on federally protected habitat. Every escalating attack stemmed from mounting terror as legal walls closed around their fraudulent scheme. Now I understood her increasingly unhinged behavior. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was pure panic from someone facing complete financial ruin and potential federal prison time for environmental terrorism. She'd gambled everything on destroying protected habitat for profit, and federal law was about to collect with interest. But here's what really twisted the knife. I held enough evidence to trigger federal criminal prosecution that could send both Wickhams to prison for decades. Environmental crimes, conspiracy to violate navigation laws, civil rights violations through systematic harassment, the federal charges would multiply like compound interest on a payday loan. One phone call to FBI Environmental Crime Unit would end this war permanently. However, my late wife Sarah had always believed in offering people one last chance at redemption before delivering justice. Maybe I could give Delilah an opportunity to surrender gracefully, admit defeat, and walk away with some dignity intact before I unleashed federal law enforcement on her criminal enterprise. Or maybe she'd continue escalating until she committed crimes so obvious that even corrupt local officials couldn't protect her from federal prosecution. Either way, I now held nuclear-level legal ammunition in a fight she'd started with cap guns and playground threats. The sweet scent of mountain pine drifting through my window carried the promise of absolute victory, and the responsibility to use that power wisely. Federal justice was coming to Pinecrest Estates, whether Delilah surrendered or forced me to call in the cavalry with badges and arrest warrants. The next morning, I started assembling my legal dream team with the methodical precision of a general planning D-Day. First call went to Dr. Miranda Solis, whose voice practically vibrated with scientific excitement through my phone speaker, while steam from my morning coffee fogged the kitchen window like battle preparations in a war room. "Rex, your lake supports the last genetically pure strain of West Slope cutthroat trout in this entire watershed. These fish are living dinosaurs. Their ancestors swam these waters when Lewis and Clark were still trying to figure out which end of a canoe goes forward. If Delilah had succeeded in draining that habitat, she would have committed biological genocide that would make Hitler weep." Dr. Solis agreed to provide bulletproof scientific documentation, proving my conservation efforts had actually enhanced the ecosystem beyond federal baseline requirements. More importantly, she'd testify that any development would violate 6 different endangered species protections I'd never even heard of. My second recruit came through a recommendation from the county librarian, Thomas Riversong from the Little Shell Tribal Council, whose great-grandfather had pulled trout from my lake before Montana was anything more than a gleam in some territorial governor's eye. When Thomas spoke about the land's cultural significance, his voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of tribal memory. "Brother, that water has been sacred to my people for over 300 years. We have federal treaty rights to traditional fishing grounds that make your HOA look like a kindergarten bake sale committee. Delilah's harassment isn't just attacking you. She's violating Native American religious freedom protected by constitutional law that predates her entire bloodline." The cultural resource protection angle added constitutional firepower I'd never considered. Native American treaty rights don't just carry legal weight. They make Supreme Court justices sit up straighter and federal prosecutors sharpen their pencils with predatory enthusiasm. Maxwell Sterling, my old Coast Guard legal officer turned environmental attorney, practically purred with professional satisfaction when I described the case details. His law firm had body-slammed corrupt developers across 12 western states, establishing precedents that made environmental criminals wake up screaming. "Rex, this case is like finding the Holy Grail wrapped in the Constitution. Environmental terrorism, civil rights violations, conspiracy to circumvent federal law, documented harassment patterns, and attempted destruction of protected habitat. We could turn your personal legal victory into a landmark that protects federal environments for the next century." Years of military experience had taught me that successful operations exploit enemy weaknesses systematically. Delilah's vulnerabilities were multiplying faster than bacteria in a petri dish, crushing debt, federal criminal exposure, documented harassment evidence, and escalating desperation that guaranteed bigger mistakes. Federal navigation servitude establishes absolute water access rights that no local authority can challenge, a principle hammered into legal bedrock in 1824 and reinforced by 2 centuries of Supreme Court decisions. Clean Water Act violations carried prison sentences up to 5 years per incident. Civil rights harassment near protected cultural sites could trigger federal hate crime prosecutions with mandatory minimum sentences that would make hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. But my strategy transcended defensive legal maneuvering. I wanted to create positive change that honored Sarah's environmental dreams while educating citizens about federal rights they never knew they possessed. We developed a comprehensive battle plan combining legal nuclear weapons, unshakable scientific evidence, constitutional protections, and media warfare. The technical preparation felt like orchestrating a Coast Guard rescue operation in hurricane conditions. Gather overwhelming intelligence, coordinate superior resources, prepare multiple contingency plans, and maintain absolute tactical advantage regardless of enemy escalation. Every harassment incident was photographed, time-stamped, and archived in multiple secure locations, like evidence for the Nuremberg trials. My evidence collection had grown into a federal prosecutor's wet dream. 53 documented harassment incidents, 9 false police reports, recorded threats, financial records exposing the development conspiracy, and federal documentation establishing 6 layers of overlapping legal protection. The paper trail was so comprehensive that Justice Department lawyers could build their cases while eating lunch and watching Netflix. During our planning sessions, the rich aroma of Thomas's sage ceremonies mixed with Dr. Solis's laboratory-grade coffee and Maxwell's expensive legal cologne, creating an olfactory cocktail that smelled like justice brewing with a side of environmental restoration. But I also designed positive community initiatives that would benefit everyone regardless of legal outcomes. Environmental Education Center featuring native fish restoration programs, cultural heritage preservation honoring tribal traditions, and conservation workshops teaching federal environmental rights to property owners facing similar harassment. The sweet mountain air drifting through my cabin windows carried the scent of pine needles and approaching victory. Sarah would have loved seeing her peaceful retreat become the foundation for protecting similar habitats across the entire region. I was locked and loaded for Delilah's final desperate crimes, armed with federal law, bulletproof scientific evidence, constitutional protections, and media support that would turn her into a cautionary tale for environmental criminals nationwide. My coalition was assembled, my evidence was overwhelming, and federal justice was chambered and ready to fire whatever desperate shots Delilah took next. The only question remaining: would she surrender gracefully or commit federal crimes so obvious that even corrupt politicians couldn't protect her from prison time? 3 days later, my security cameras captured footage that made my blood boil hotter than lava in Yellowstone. Delilah creeping around my property at 3 a.m. with a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket, dumping pool chemicals directly into my federally protected lake like some kind of suburban eco-terrorist in designer yoga pants. The infrared video showed her moving with all the stealth of a rhinoceros in a china shop while Garrett sat in their idling Escalade, apparently serving as getaway driver for environmental crimes. The sharp, chlorinated stench hit my nostrils the next morning like a chemical punch to the face. Dead cutthroat trout floated belly up among the cattails, their ancient silver scales glinting like fallen stars in the sunrise. My hands trembled with pure fury as I photographed the crime scene, documenting what amounted to biological genocide against species that had survived ice ages only to die from HOA President chemicals. But Delilah's sabotage spree was just getting warmed up. She hired Vernon Class, a bottom-feeding private investigator who looked like he'd been rejected from mall security for excessive creepiness, to excavate dirt on my military background. Vernon spent 2 weeks tailing me in a rust bucket Camaro that backfired like artillery fire, apparently hoping to uncover dark secrets that would justify 3 months of criminal harassment. What this discount store Magnum PI discovered instead was 30 years of exemplary Coast Guard service, 3 environmental rescue commendations, and a record so clean it practically sparkled. Frustrated that reality refused to match Delilah's paranoid fantasies, Vernon pivoted to spreading whispered rumors about me being an unstable combat veteran with dangerous PTSD who threatens innocent families. The irony was thicker than molasses in January. While painting me as mentally unstable, Delilah was literally committing environmental terrorism against federally protected wildlife. It's like calling someone crazy while setting your own house on fire. Meanwhile, federal law enforcement began circling her criminal enterprise like hungry wolves catching the scent of fresh stupidity. The Environmental Protection Agency launched formal investigations after Dr. Solis reported the chemical poisoning incident with photographic evidence and water quality analysis. FBI Environmental Crime Unit opened preliminary files tracking the systematic harassment pattern targeting federal habitat protections. Every documented incident expanded Delilah's federal criminal exposure exponentially. Environmental terrorism under Clean Water Act violations, conspiracy to circumvent federal navigation laws, interference with protected species habitat, and civil rights harassment. The woman was essentially building her own federal prison sentence, one felony at a time, like collecting stamps but with handcuffs. Her financial hemorrhaging reached critical mass as foreclosure proceedings accelerated. Garrett's construction company faced 4 new lawsuits from abandoned projects, while unpaid supplier bills exceeded $70,000. Local contractors whispered that Wickham Construction had become radioactive. Nobody would work with them, supply them materials, or even return their increasingly desperate phone calls. Then Delilah made the mistake that would provide federal prosecutors with a beautiful bow on their criminal case package. She cornered me behind the Safeway parking lot on Thursday evening, looking like she hadn't slept since the Clinton administration. Dark circles shadowed her bloodshot eyes, while her usually magazine-perfect hair hung limp as overcooked linguine. The cloying mixture of expensive perfume and pure desperation created an olfactory disaster that made me step upwind. "Rex, let's be adults about this situation. I can offer you $300,000 cash to simply walk away quietly. Everyone wins, nobody gets hurt further." I kept my phone recording in my jacket pocket as she essentially dictated her confession to federal investigators. The rustle of autumn leaves underfoot provided natural background music for her criminal admissions. Look, this whole thing spiraled beyond anyone's intentions. Garrett's business is collapsing, and we honestly thought we could reach some kind of reasonable accommodation. Maybe we pushed too hard initially, but surely we can find middle ground. The beautiful irony? attempting to bribe someone into surrendering federally protected environmental rights constitutes additional federal felonies. I was witnessing a desperate criminal actively expanding her own legal jeopardy while believing she was negotiating a graceful exit strategy. Delilah, you've systematically poisoned protected habitat, filed dozens of false police reports, and harassed me for months using environmental terrorism. You think $300,000 erases federal crimes? Her carefully maintained facade cracked like eggshells under pressure. You don't comprehend the financial pressure we're experiencing. This development represented our entire retirement strategy. Without those profits, we lose our house, our business, everything we've worked toward. That recorded confession would sound like symphonic music to federal prosecutors. Crystal clear admission that the harassment campaign was designed to circumvent environmental protections for illegal financial profit through intimidation and criminal activity. But Delilah's desperation drove her toward the federal crime that would seal her fate permanently. Vernon Class began approaching county officials with envelopes stuffed with cash, attempting to bribe them into falsely declaring my lake a public health emergency, requiring immediate drainage for community safety. His fatal mistake? Offering $15,000 to Deputy Martinez's brother-in-law, who immediately reported the bribery attempt to federal authorities while wearing a wire for the follow-up meeting. FBI recordings captured Vernon explicitly offering cash payments to falsify environmental assessments, forge public health documents, and obstruct federal environmental enforcement. The federal criminal case now included conspiracy, environmental terrorism, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice, and racketeering charges that could send both Wickhams to federal prison for decades. Regional media coverage exploded as the story evolved from neighborhood dispute into federal environmental crime investigation. HOA President's environmental terror campaign dominated headlines while social media hashtags like #SaveClearwaterLake gained viral traction across conservation networks. The sweet metallic taste of absolute victory flooded my mouth as I realized Delilah had systematically violated every possible federal environmental law while documenting her own crimes through security footage and recorded confessions. She'd essentially prosecuted herself while trying to intimidate me into surrender. Her final desperate gambit would be so spectacularly illegal that even corrupt local politicians couldn't shield her from immediate federal arrest and prosecution. Delilah's financial Hail Mary arrived in the form of Blackstone and Associates, a predatory Denver law firm that specialized in environmental harassment for developers with Swiss cheese morals and deep pockets. Their $90,000 retainer, financed by mortgaging everything the Wickhams owned twice over, bought them a federal lawsuit that read like fan fiction written by someone who'd never seen a law book. The complaint alleged I was conducting systematic federal fraud through fabricated environmental documentation designed to circumvent legitimate community development and terrorize law-abiding families through bureaucratic weaponization. Reading their legal filing felt like watching someone perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer while blindfolded. But Delilah's digital warfare campaign reached new depths of creative desperation. She launched a bot army that would make Russian election interference look like amateur hour, flooding local social media with fake accounts claiming I was an environmental extremist funded by communist organizations who hate American property rights and family values. The bots had names like Patriot Mom 47 and Freedom Fighter 1776, posting identical messages about dangerous veterans using federal bureaucracy to destroy innocent communities. It was like watching someone try to start a revolution using action figures and a megaphone made from a toilet paper roll. Anonymous flyers materialized throughout Pinecrest featuring my military portrait with ominous warnings about radical environmental terrorists disguised as veterans. The cheap paper smelled like desperation mixed with Kinko's toner, creating an olfactory cocktail that screamed criminal conspiracy planned by idiots. Meanwhile, federal reinforcements arrived like the Marines landing at Normandy. Army Corps of Engineers filed amicus briefs that made Delilah's expensive lawyers develop stress ulcers. Federal navigation servitude establishes absolute waterway protection that supersedes all local authority. Interference constitutes federal environmental crimes prosecutable under 12 overlapping statutes with mandatory minimum sentences. Environmental Protection Agency assigned Special Agent Jennifer Walsh to coordinate what had become the largest federal environmental crime investigation in Montana history. FBI Environmental Crime Unit opened offices in the county courthouse, turning Delilah's hometown into the epicenter of federal law enforcement activity that attracted media attention from 3 states. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division launched parallel investigations into systematic harassment, targeting federal environmental rights, elevating my case into constitutional law territory that made Supreme Court clerks sharpen their pencils with anticipation. The community backlash hit Delilah like a tsunami of righteous fury. Thomas Riversong's tribal council issued a statement that scorched earth. Mrs. Wickham's environmental racism represents centuries of colonial violence against sacred waters. Our ancestors' treaty rights will be defended through every legal mechanism available, including federal hate crime prosecution. Local veterans organization released a declaration that could have melted titanium. Rex Thornfield embodies military honor defending federal environmental law. Delilah Wickham's attacks on a decorated veteran constitute unpatriotic behavior that dishonors everything our service members fought to protect. Environmental groups organized nationwide campaigns flooding congressional offices with demands for aggressive prosecution. Social media exploded with #federal rights vs. HOA terror hashtags, gaining viral support across conservation networks that reached millions of Americans. County commissioners began fleeing Wickham Association faster than tourists escaping Yellowstone bear encounters, suddenly developing convenient amnesia about years of golf partnerships and under-the-table development deals. But Delilah's escalating desperation drove her to crimes so spectacularly stupid they belonged in criminal law textbooks. Security footage captured her attempting to remove federal waterway markers using bolt cutters, wearing a disguise that fooled absolutely nobody. Dark sunglasses, a baseball cap, and the same designer yoga outfit she wore to every HOA meeting. The woman had all the criminal sophistication of a toddler trying to steal cookies while covered in chocolate evidence. Vernon Class achieved new heights of criminal incompetence when FBI surveillance recorded him attempting to plant evidence on my property at midnight. Federal agents watched through night vision scopes as he buried plastic bags near my dock, apparently trying to frame me for drug trafficking using baking soda purchased at Walmart with his own credit card. The sweet irony? Vernon's evidence-planting operation was so ineptly executed that federal investigators used it as training footage for How Not to Commit Federal Crimes 101 Inches seminars. Federal prosecutors connected Delilah's harassment to a massive racketeering investigation spanning corrupt officials, predatory developers, and environmental criminals across 3 counties. Her case became the keystone that brought down an entire network of small-town corruption that had operated for decades. Grand jury subpoenas flew like confetti during Mardi Gras, demanding records from planning offices, construction companies, and HOA management firms. Bank investigators uncovered fraudulent loan schemes, systematic bribery operations, and environmental crime funding that made organized crime syndicates look like church bake sales. Federal charges multiplied exponentially. Environmental terrorism, Clean Water Act conspiracy, racketeering, public corruption, obstruction of federal enforcement, civil rights violations, and fraud counts that could imprison both Wickhams until their great-grandchildren collected Social Security. State agencies levied $300,000 in fines against Garrett's construction company for systematic environmental violations. Federal investigators discovered years of illegal dumping into protected waterways while bribing inspectors to falsify compliance reports, a criminal enterprise that had poisoned ecosystems throughout the region. Asset forfeiture laws froze all Wickham property pending criminal prosecution. Their magazine-perfect house, luxury vehicles, and construction equipment became evidence in federal cases, leaving them financially obliterated before trials even commenced. Federal restraining orders prohibited any contact between Delilah and federal officials, environmental resources, or me personally. Violations would trigger immediate arrest and detention without bail for terrorism charges that carried potential life sentences. The crisp November air carried the metallic scent of approaching snow and absolute federal justice. Delilah had systematically violated every environmental law in existence while documenting her own crimes through surveillance footage, recorded confessions, and federal court filings that read like criminal autobiographies. Her final public performance would unfold at tomorrow's county commissioners' meeting, where federal agents planned to serve arrest warrants while national media documented the spectacular collapse of environmental terrorism disguised as suburban community standards. Federal justice was arriving in Pinecrest Estates with handcuffs, prison sentences, and environmental protections that would endure for generations of wildlife Delilah had tried to destroy for profit. The county commissioners' meeting that night packed more drama than a reality TV show finale. The community center reeked of nervous sweat, burnt coffee, and the kind of electric tension that makes smart people check for emergency exits. Standing room only didn't begin to describe the circus. People lined the walls like they were waiting for the second coming, except this time it came with federal arrest warrants and news cameras. 3 TV news crews set up equipment that hummed with electronic anticipation, while newspaper reporters clutched notebooks like lifelines. Federal observers sat quietly in the back rows, their dark suits and earpieces making them look like Secret Service agents protecting the Constitution itself. Delilah arrived fashionably late with her expensive Denver lawyers trailing behind like designer-clad vultures, apparently still believing that aggressive legal representation could override federal environmental law. She wore her best innocent victim outfit, conservative blue blazer, pearl earrings, and a facial expression suggesting she smelled something unpleasant but was too polite to mention it. I entered carrying nothing but a simple manila folder containing federal documentation that weighed more than Delilah's entire legal strategy. The audience was a fascinating mixture. My supporters, including Thomas Riversong in traditional tribal regalia, Dr. Solis with scientific charts, Maxwell Sterling radiating legal confidence, concerned neighbors, veterans in dress uniforms, environmental activists with cameras, and enough federal law enforcement to staff a small army base. Commissioner Patricia Williams called the meeting to order with the nervous energy of someone defusing a bomb in front of live television. We're here to address ongoing disputes regarding property rights, federal jurisdiction, and community standards in the Pinecrest area. Delilah's lead attorney, James Blackstone, stood first with the theatrical flair of someone who'd been watching too much Law and Order. Commissioners, my client represents the legitimate interests of hardworking families facing environmental terrorism from federal bureaucrats and outside agitators seeking to destroy American property rights through fraudulent claims and bureaucratic intimidation. His 40-minute presentation combined more logical fallacies than a freshman philosophy textbook, arguing that federal environmental protection somehow violated local property rights, that my military service made me unsuitable for civilian neighborhood integration, and that HOA authority superseded constitutional law because community standards reflect democratic values. The performance was so legally absurd that even his own co-counsel started fidgeting like they wanted to disappear into witness protection programs. Then Delilah took the microphone for her final public meltdown. Fellow citizens, we face an unprecedented assault on our way of life by environmental extremists using federal bureaucracy to impose socialist control over private property rights. Her voice cracked with desperation as months of suppressed panic finally erupted. This man represents everything wrong with government overreach destroying American communities. She waved printed copies of my federal documentation like they were contaminated evidence. These so-called protections are fraudulent federal intimidation designed to prevent legitimate development that would benefit our entire community. We cannot allow outside agitators to use environmental lies to destroy property values and family security. The racist dog whistles became air raid sirens as she continued. Certain people with questionable backgrounds use military service to manipulate federal agencies against law-abiding families who built this community through honest work and shared values. That's when I stood up, folder in hand, and delivered the mic drop moment that would end her criminal career permanently. Commissioner Williams, thank you for allowing me to respond to these fascinating allegations. My voice carried the calm authority of 30 years enforcing federal law in conditions far more challenging than suburban temper tantrums. Mrs. Wickham claims my federal environmental protections are fraudulent. Let me share some actual documentation with this community. I opened my folder and began reading official federal correspondence dated and signed by authorities whose jurisdiction she couldn't challenge with clipboard tantrums and designer lawsuits. Army Corps of Engineers Northwestern Division. Clearwater Creek and associated water bodies enjoy federal protection under navigation servitude, established 1824, reinforced by Supreme Court precedent in 15 cases, most recently affirmed 2019. Local interference constitutes federal environmental crimes prosecutable under multiple statutes. Delilah's face cycled through more colors than a broken traffic light as I continued. Environmental Protection Agency, Criminal Enforcement Division. Investigation PCP 2024 Montana reveals systematic environmental harassment, illegal chemical dumping, and conspiracy to violate Clean Water Act protections. Federal criminal charges recommended for immediate prosecution. The real bombshell came with my final document. FBI Environmental Crime Unit. Surveillance operation confirms environmental terrorism, bribery of public officials, and systematic harassment targeting federally protected resources. Arrest warrants issued for Delilah Wickham and associates on charges of federal environmental crimes, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. That's when FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh stood from the back row, badge displayed, and delivered the words that ended Delilah's war permanently. Delilah Wickham, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal environmental law, terrorism against protected habitat, bribery of public officials, and civil rights violations. You have the right to remain silent." Delilah's shriek of, "This is persecution," echoed through the packed room as handcuffs clicked around her wrists while 3 television cameras captured every moment for posterity and YouTube immortality. The audience erupted in applause that sounded like thunder rolling through mountain valleys. Thomas Riversong began a traditional victory chant while Dr. Solis literally jumped up and down with scientific joy. Veterans saluted as Delilah was escorted out in federal custody, her expensive lawyers scrambling to avoid guilt by association. Commissioner Williams banged her gavel repeatedly, shouting for order while flashbulbs exploded like fireworks, and reporters shouted questions about federal environmental enforcement that would dominate headlines for months. The sweet taste of absolute victory filled my mouth as I watched federal justice finally arrive in Pinecrest Estates with handcuffs, criminal charges, and environmental protections that would last forever. 6 months later, federal justice had transformed Pinecrest from a suburban dictatorship into something resembling an actual community. Delilah received 18 months in federal prison for environmental terrorism, conspiracy, and civil rights violations, a sentence that made other HOA tyrants across the country suddenly discover the virtues of reasonable neighbor relations. Garrett got 5 years for fraud, environmental crimes, and running what federal prosecutors called a criminal enterprise masquerading as a construction business. The $500,000 in federal fines and restitution funded something beautiful: the Clearwater Environmental Education Center, built on the former Wickham property after foreclosure proceedings. The irony was delicious. Land they'd tried to destroy for profit became a permanent monument to environmental protection and federal law education. My lake received official designation as Clearwater Critical Habitat Preserve under federal management, ensuring protection that would outlast every future HOA president until the sun burned out. Dr. Solis established a permanent research station studying native trout populations that had rebounded dramatically under proper stewardship. Her graduate students filled the cabins each summer with the sounds of scientific discovery and environmental hope. The annual Clearwater Conservation Festival attracted over 8,000 visitors during its second year, featuring Thomas Riversong's cultural workshops, environmental education programs, and the kind of community celebrations Sarah would have loved. Food trucks serving locally sourced meals lined the access road, while children learned about federal environmental rights through hands-on activities that made conservation feel like adventure rather than homework. But the real transformation happened in the neighborhood itself. The old HOA dissolved faster than sugar in rainwater, replaced by the Pinecrest Neighbors Alliance, a voluntary organization focused on mutual support rather than authoritarian control. Amazing what happens when you remove the person treating community involvement like military dictatorship with clipboard privileges. Mrs. Isla's community garden project flourished on a corner of the former Wickham property, growing organic vegetables that neighbors shared freely while learning about sustainable agriculture. The sweet scent of tomatoes and herbs replaced the bitter smell of suburban paranoia that had poisoned the area for years. My personal healing accelerated with the help of an unexpected development. Romance bloomed with Dr. Solis during our long conversations about ecosystem restoration and environmental protection. She moved into the cabin the following spring, bringing scientific equipment, a rescue dog named Clearwater, and the kind of partnership Sarah would have approved of wholeheartedly. The legal precedent established by Thornfield v. Pinecrest Estates became required reading in environmental law schools nationwide. Maxwell Sterling's firm used my case to win 12 subsequent federal habitat protection cases, establishing what legal scholars call the Clearwater Doctrine for federal environmental rights versus local corruption. 3 years later, I received a phone call that proved the fight's broader impact. Marine veteran Elena Rodriguez from Colorado faced similar HOA harassment over solar panels required for her military disability accommodations. Her HOA claimed renewable energy violated community aesthetic standards while threatening massive fines and legal action. "Rex, I read about your case online. These people are trying to use HOA rules to override federal disability rights. Can you help me understand how federal law works when local authorities exceed their jurisdiction?" That call launched what became the Federal Rights Defense Network, a coalition of veterans, environmental advocates, and civil rights lawyers helping citizens navigate federal protections when local authorities overreach their legal boundaries. We've since helped over 200 families defend their federal rights against corrupt local officials nationwide. The practical takeaways from my battle became educational gold for property owners facing similar harassment. Federal waterway protections trump all local regulations without exception. Environmental harassment near protected habitats triggers federal criminal investigation. Systematic harassment patterns can escalate simple neighbor disputes into federal civil rights cases. Most importantly, documenting everything with dates and evidence transforms individual complaints into federal prosecution opportunities. My cabin walls display framed letters from families who've successfully defended their federal rights using lessons learned from the Clearwater case. A Wyoming rancher defeated HOA attempts to restrict his federal grazing rights. A disabled veteran in Arizona used federal accessibility laws to override HOA solar panel restrictions. An Oregon family protected their wetland restoration project from development pressure using federal habitat protection precedents. But the most meaningful transformation involved personal healing and community building that honored Sarah's memory. The Environmental Scholarship Fund established in her name has sent 43 students to study conservation science, creating a living legacy that multiplies environmental protection knowledge across the country. Clearwater Creek still babbles its ancient song toward the Salmon River, carrying the same pure mountain water that sustained Native American communities for centuries. Native trout spawn in carefully maintained gravel beds, while osprey nest in platforms I built along the shoreline. The ecosystem thrives under federal protection that no future development scheme can circumvent. On quiet evenings, I float on the same inner tube where this whole adventure began, watching hawks circle overhead while Clearwater, the dog, patrols the shoreline for interesting smells, and Miranda analyzes water samples for her ongoing research. The sweet scent of pine needles mixes with the sound of children learning about environmental protection at the education center. Sometimes I imagine Sarah floating beside me, smiling at how her dream of peaceful mountain living became the foundation for protecting similar places across the entire region. The best revenge against environmental criminals isn't just winning, it's building something beautiful and permanent where they tried to destroy natural heritage for profit. Federal law protected more than my property rights. It preserved a piece of American wilderness for future generations who deserve clean water, healthy ecosystems, and the knowledge that citizens can successfully defend federal environmental protections when corrupt local authorities overreach their legal boundaries. So here's my challenge to you. Share your HOA nightmare story in the comments below. Which federal laws might protect your situation? You'd be amazed how many local authority overreach problems have federal solutions just waiting for citizens brave enough to research their actual rights. And don't forget to subscribe for more David versus Goliath stories where knowledge of federal law defeats corruption, environmental criminals get federal justice, and regular citizens discover they have more legal power than they ever imagined. Next week's story: how a disabled Marine used federal accessibility laws and solar panel regulations to completely destroy an HOA's discriminatory restrictions while saving $8,000 annually on energy costs. You won't believe what happened when they tried to fine him for unsightly renewable energy installations.